Turns out Prince Harry and Meghan Markle will still get paid millions of dollars for doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah, they were very worried about their safety, which I get that aspect of things. I wanted to attack them.
If you came up with the picture of an annoying, insufferable white woman, it would be Meghan Markle.
Meghan Markle has finally revealed why she and Prince Harry call each other M and H.
I had no idea how racist they were. It's the royal family!
It all started with a single line delivered under the bright lights of Saturday Night Live. Millions were watching live, and in that moment, it felt like the entire world held its breath. Colin Jost, the Weekend Update anchor known for smiling as he twisted the knife, looked straight into the camera and unleashed a savage punchline that didn't just land, it detonated. President Trump also announced a new trade deal with the UK. All that Britain demands in return is that we keep these two. Crowd exploded with laughter, and somewhere across the ocean, Meghan Markle was probably gripping her phone, her jaw clenched, feeling the heat creep up her neck as she realized she'd become the punchline to a joke she couldn't control. Because for Meghan, whose entire public persona has been carefully curated around polished appearances and measured statements, this was the worst-case scenario. Someone calling out the thing she dreads most, the perception that she and Harry are worth more as spectacle than substance. That's why, behind the scenes, people close to her say she was livid, furious that SNL had turned her life into a running gag, upset that millions were laughing at the idea that she'd traded the palace for a paycheck, and ended up with neither respect nor privacy. And while Harry has always tried to project a stoic front, even he must have felt the sting of that moment, watching the carefully built narrative of their victimhood crumble under the weight of a single joke. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was humiliation on a grand, unfiltered scale. For Meghan, whose relationship with the press has been defined by tension and litigation, SNL represented the very machine she'd been trying to escape. The machine that could take your story and reshape it into whatever would get the biggest laugh. Some insiders say that when the clip went viral within hours, Meghan's team scrambled to figure out how to respond, if at all. Should they release a statement? Should they ignore it and hope the news cycle would move on? But ignoring something that viral was almost impossible. And it was even harder when the internet was already flooded with memes replaying her most vulnerable moments next to Colin's smirk. Meghan has always believed in controlling her image. This was the one moment she couldn't, and that loss of control probably stung worse than any headline. But the real shock wasn't just that SNL had gone after her. It was how quickly the rest of Hollywood followed suit. 'Cause while late-night hosts have always dipped their toes into royal gossip, something shifted after that episode. It was as if Colin Jost's punchline opened a floodgate. Suddenly, every comedian, every award show host, every late-night monologue seemed to revolve around the same theme: that Meghan and Harry had become a spectacle, that their story of escaping the palace was starting to look a lot less noble and a lot more opportunistic. And for people who had invested so much energy into convincing the public they were victims of circumstance, this new narrative was more than inconvenient. It was devastating. The Golden Globes was the next stop on this unstoppable train of ridicule. Host Joe Coy stood before an audience filled with A-listers, people who had spent years earning their reputations, and with a single line, he cut through the last shreds of sympathy. Turns out Prince Harry and Meghan Markle will still get paid millions of dollars for doing absolutely nothing. The laughter that followed was different from the polite chuckles that usually greet award show banter. It was raw, cathartic, almost gleeful. It was as if everyone in the room was tired of pretending that the Sussexes were anything more than the sum of their carefully orchestrated press tours and lucrative deals. It was the kind of moment Meghan had spent her entire career trying to avoid. Public rejection wrapped in the sugarcoating of comedy. And while Harry often tries to project indifference to these barbs, friends say he's more thin-skinned than he lets on. Behind closed doors, this kind of widespread derision is exactly what keeps him up at night. But it didn't stop there. 'Cause when Trevor Noah picked up the baton on The Daily Show, the joke took on a sharper edge. He imagined Meghan looking across the breakfast table at Harry, sighing in frustration and telling him, "You need to get a job." It was the kind of line that hits because it feels true, like the secret thought that even their fans had started to wonder. And once the illusion of dignity cracks, it's almost impossible to repair. Late-night TV had smelled blood in the water, and every host wanted their moment to tear down the myth of the selfless royal escapees. Jimmy Kimmel, never one to hold back, took it a step further by questioning the very premise of their flight from the UK. He reminded his audience that Meghan and Harry had claimed racism was at the core of their departure, a serious, sobering accusation that had once garnered worldwide sympathy. But Kimmel, with that trademark smirk, pointed out the obvious contradiction. Things must have been bad at Buckingham Palace if they came to America to get away from racism. Crowd erupted in knowing laughter, the kind that signals a collective agreement. The absurdity of their narrative was starting to outshine any compassion people once felt. And for Meghan, who has always positioned herself as a voice for social justice, this was more than a PR setback. It was a personal repudiation. But while late-night hosts were dismantling the Sussex brand on television, the comedians of the stand-up circuit were sharpening their knives for an even more savage assault. Ricky Gervais, the master of ruthless honesty, took aim at their sense of entitlement, recounting stories of royal events where not a single famous guest paid their way. It was a simple point, that the same privilege Harry and Meghan claimed to have abandoned was still alive and well in every aspect of their lives. And once Gervais opened that door, other comedians piled on. John Mulaney skipped the pretense of analysis altogether and just went for the throat, calling Harry a dumb ginger who should have just waited out his grandmother. The audience howled because it was the kind of joke that didn't bother pretending to be nuanced. It was a reminder that no amount of curated Instagram posts could erase the perception that Harry had torched his royal legacy for nothing. Then there was Tim Dillon, who didn't just question Meghan's motives but attacked her character with a vehemence that bordered on personal. He painted her as the ultimate example of self-importance, a woman convinced she was saving the world by selling jam and honey. The message was clear. The public was tired of her moral lectures delivered from multi-million-dollar estates. For Meghan, who has always clung to her image as a principled reformer, this was the ugliest narrative imaginable. But the critique that cut deepest came from Chris Rock. Because when he spoke, the world listened. Here was a man whose entire career was built on dissecting race and privilege with a scalpel. So when he addressed the infamous allegation that someone in the royal family had speculated about Archie's skin tone, everyone braced for solidarity. Instead, Chris Rock shrugged and said, "That's not racist. Even black people want to know how brown the baby's going to be." It was the moment that took the Sussexes' most serious claim and transformed it into a punchline. The audience erupted, and with that, their last shred of untouchable victimhood was gone. By the time South Park dedicated an entire episode to lampooning them, it felt like overkill. But the show's creators understood that humor is the most potent weapon against self-importance. They didn't just mock Meghan and Harry's hypocrisy, they immortalized it in animation. Private jet with the megaphone screaming for privacy became an instant symbol of everything the couple claimed to reject, and yet eagerly chased. When the credits rolled, there was no question left. Public had made up its mind. And while the cartoons were savage, the final humiliation came not from any comedian or late-night host, but from Harry himself. During his interview with Stephen Colbert, there was a moment so awkward, so revealing, it felt like the mask slipped entirely. When Colbert offered a simple piece of wisdom, "Let us have an end to this debate about what makes a good man and be one," Harry responded with a hollow good knowledge, oblivious to the weight of the advice. You could almost see the discomfort ripple across the audience. It was the kind of moment that confirmed every suspicion, that beneath the curated image was someone desperately trying to fit in, yet never quite succeeding. The final straw came when Harry's memoir and Netflix documentary revealed a torrent of complaints about their struggles. Struggles that, to most people, sounded like the gripes of the unimaginably privileged. The same people who once cried with them had started to roll their eyes. Because there is only so much sympathy the public can spare for celebrities who insist on telling us how hard their luxury is. And when the laughter of the comedians faded, it was replaced by something far more dangerous to their brand: indifference. So now, as Meghan and Harry consider their next move, one question remains. Can they ever recover from this perfect storm of mockery, contradiction, and self-sabotage? Or has the story of their lives become the very thing they claim to despise? A spectacle designed to entertain the masses? Because in the end, it wasn't just Colin Jost's joke that humiliated Meghan Markle. It was the collective realization that perhaps, just perhaps, the fairy tale was never about freedom or truth. It was always about attention. And the court of public opinion doesn't forget. And behind closed doors, while the cameras turned their attention to the next trending scandal, insiders say Meghan's mood was anything but composed. Some who claim to have worked with her during those tense weeks after the SNL monologue described an atmosphere thick with frustration, bordering on panic. She's always been someone who values preparation and polish, who believes that if you plan every word and control every angle, you can shape any narrative. But there's no controlling live television, and there's certainly no stopping the viral flood of social media. Every time she refreshed her phone, another clip popped up, edited, memed, twisted to show her as the clueless villain of her own story. And for a woman who once dreamed of being admired for her poise and activism, that was a deeper humiliation than any tabloid headline. Meanwhile, Harry reportedly tried to play the role of the unbothered husband, insisting that it was all just noise that would fade. But even he couldn't ignore the reality that SNL and South Park weren't fringe commentators. They were cultural institutions. When they decide you're the butt of the joke, it isn't just a bad week. It's the start of a narrative shift that's nearly impossible to reverse. One former royal aide put it bluntly. They spent years trying to turn themselves into symbols of moral authority, but once the comedians got hold of them, they turned back into what they started as: two celebrities desperate for attention. It was a verdict harsher than any front page. And it wasn't just comedians lining up for a piece of the spectacle. Other celebrities, people who once publicly supported Meghan and Harry, began to distance themselves, quietly at first, then more openly. The same A-list crowd that had welcomed them into Hollywood with flattery and invitations now seemed cautious, even wary. No one wanted to be the next to have their brand tarnished by proximity to the couple's increasingly messy story. Even those who believed the Sussexes had legitimate grievances found it hard to defend the endless complaints and the apparent inability to move forward. Because at a certain point, people get tired of hearing about your trauma when you've been given every opportunity to heal, and chose instead to monetize it. That shift in public mood was perhaps the most devastating consequence of all. The beginning, when Meghan and Harry first stepped away from the royal family, there was a genuine wellspring of sympathy. Millions believed they were victims of an archaic institution, fighting to protect their family. The Oprah interview was watched around the world and felt, in the moment, like a cultural milestone. But sympathy is a currency you only get to spend once. The more interviews they did, the more documentaries they released, the more memoirs they published, the less special their story became. It started to feel like a product, one they were determined to keep selling long after the audience had moved on. By the time the South Park episode aired, the public had reached what one commentator called compassion fatigue. There was no more outrage to be mined, no more tears to be shed. All that was left was the slow, awkward realization that the couple who had once demanded privacy had become experts in self-exposure. And in that realization, something broke. Even former supporters began to roll their eyes, because the contradiction was too glaring to ignore. You can't cry about the cruelty of the spotlight while chasing every camera you see. You can't claim to reject the monarchy's trappings while cashing in on them. Eventually, people stop caring about the reasons and start caring only about the spectacle. And that spectacle reached its most absurd heights in the weeks following the SNL takedown. Every late-night show, every podcast, every gossip site had an angle. Some speculated about Meghan's state of mind, suggesting she was rattled and devastated. Others framed it as poetic justice, claiming this was the inevitable consequence of a strategy that relied too heavily on public sympathy. But the most consistent theme was simpler: the sense that everyone was, at last, seeing through the carefully constructed image. What remained wasn't a pair of courageous truth-tellers, but two people hopelessly addicted to fame. Harry's own behavior didn't help. His book, Spare, had already generated headlines for its cringe-inducing details, like the revelation that he had lost his virginity behind a pub, or the bizarre anecdotes about frostbite. But it was his appearance on Stephen Colbert's show that solidified the sense that he wasn't in on the joke. When Colbert offered that quote about simply becoming a good man, Harry's vacant response, "good knowledge," felt like a moment of pure, unfiltered disconnect. You could almost hear the collective wince of the audience. It was the moment when the last of the mystery evaporated, leaving only the awkward spectacle of a man trying too hard to seem ordinary while clinging to the trappings of royalty. And Meghan, the woman once praised as a modern, relatable princess, had now become something closer to a cautionary tale. Her attempts to launch lifestyle ventures, like the cooking show rumored to feature store-bought food passed off as her own creations, became punchlines. Her M and H nicknames, once meant to show warmth, became symbols of contrivance. Even her famous yoga sessions were mocked by other celebrities who found her mere presence disruptive. It was as if every small detail of her life had been reinterpreted through the lens of ridicule.